As I read through the readings for this day, it became obvious to me that there's an amazing repetitive action that goes on. And when I read it, I just jotted down notes that I'd share with you. What is it about this world that it can so easily ignore the poor as though it were all their fault, and then ridicule those who seek to help them? Our readings began not with Jesus, but with Isaiah the prophet, speaking about how he tries to speak to the weary, a word that would arouse them. Each morning he says that the Lord opens his ears that he may hear. But then quickly, in the next sentence, he speaks of how he gave his back to those who beat him, his cheeks to those who plucked his beard, his face that he did not shield from buffets and spitting. He is telling us that God will not put him to shame. So he keeps talking about the ministry he does for those in need, and then he talks about how he's ridiculed and hurt for that. Paul, writing to the Philippians, speaks of Jesus as one who did not regard equality with God something to be grasped. Rather, he emptied himself of divinity and took the form of a slave, eventually leading him to the cross. God exalted him and bestowed upon him the name which is above every name, a name to which all should kneel in heaven and on earth. For can we not? He brings us the answer to the world. One must learn to go down before one goes up. There's a number of writers that point that out when they talk about Jesus. He emptied himself, he went down among the people, and that was his way up. It's something like we might see in a story about a man who owns a large corporation and has a dutiful son that is anxious to take over for his dad when his dad retires. And his dad says to him, "Son, you'll begin in the mailroom like I did. You've got to learn to go down and get to know all of these people with whom you work, and one day you'll be knowledgeable enough to take over the corporation." And of course, there is Jesus standing before the scribes and the priests, who were the men on the top. It was not so much that all of the Jews yelled for Jesus' death. It was that the religious leaders, the one most threatened by his presence, that were anxious for his death. It often reminded me that to be less concerned about their position, and that Jesus was trying to warn them not to be so concerned about their position or their authority or the clothes they wore. Sounds like the same thing Bishop Francis has been trying to tell the leaders of the Curia. And in the house with the leper made whole, Simon could not understand the woman who dared to pour precious oil on the feet of Jesus. Jesus reminds Simon and us, the poor will always be with us, perhaps always there for our recognition and help. Jesus was turned in by Judas in some hope of getting to the top now that he has his 30 pieces of silver. And later at the cross, the rest of the disciples were sleeping as Jesus was, suffering and shedding blood. They were still asleep. In the end, Jesus stood before the religious leaders and was sent to the cross, where Peter denied him. Some of the people watching preferred to shout out that Barabbas, a murderer, should be freed instead of the man who healed and forgave. What is wrong with the world? Why does the world so ignore the poor while making its way to the top? Bishop Oscar Romero in South America dared to take a side with the poor. He was murdered by a man hired by those Catholics and military who did not like his attention to them because they were afraid if they were too free and too well schooled, they would catch on to how they were being abused. The Bishop of New York City asked Dorothy Day to remove the word Catholic from her Catholic worker movement, which she had printed on the window of where she helped so many who were poor and desperate. And the bishop came, he says, Dorothy, please do me a favor, take the word Catholic off of that. They all think you're a communist. Of course, Dorothy said, well, Bishop, I think certainly maybe the Archbishop across the river would have us. Oh, now, Dorothy, you wouldn't do that to me, would you? And in the end, the bishop had to say to Dorothy as he left, Dear lady, I could never do what you're doing. He learned a little bit about himself and much about Dorothy. The Jesuits and the religious women killed for their attention to the poor, afraid perhaps they would provide the power of education and the poor would rebel. One man years ago I read about, his whole mission to these poor people was to school them, was to allow them to learn how to read. And how he did that, he wrote books dealing with what was going on in their lives. And as the powerful ones saw what was going on and knew that these people would soonly be more aware of what was going on, they brought in the only weapon they had that would stop it, and that was a bulldozer that would bulldoze all the books back down into the ground. The poor we will always have with us. And Jesus said, what you do for them, you do for me. His passion is for all, teaching us again and again that the way to peace and justice is not power, but always sacrificial love. I'm grateful to be a part of a parish that has come more and more to know that. I'm thankful for all you do in your own sacrificial love, taking so much time to work with others, to be aware of those in need, to take on the big causes of our world. And you do so because you have chosen to be a disciple and to follow the one who was crucified.